John Paul Stevens was born in Chicago a few months before American women were granted the constitutional right to vote. 90 summers later, he concluded his service on the U.S. Supreme Court, an acclaimed champion of individual and minority rights. The day before Japan attacked the United States on December 7, 1941, John Paul Stevens completed a correspondence course in cryptanalysis and enlisted in the U.S. Navy. Unlike Japanese-American linguists working secretly in the U.S. Military Intelligence Service, Stevens did not know Japanese. His unit tracked Japanese Army and Navy movements courtesy of MIS translations of captured documents and intercepted broadcasts. Stevens was on watch when this partnership determined Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was in flight to the Solomon Islands, allowing American fighters to shoot down his aircraft, costing Japan the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. John Paul Stevens was awarded the Bronze Star for his military service. After the war, Justice Stevens went to law school, influenced by advice from his older brother Jim. By 1970, the United States was facing civil unrest on many fronts and in many forms, often presenting significant issues about individual rights to our federal courts. It was at this time, after years in private practice, that Justice Stevens joined the Seventh Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. 5 years later, President Gerald Ford nominated Stevens to the United States Supreme Court. Stevens was confirmed 98-0 in the United States Senate. President Ford became the first president to appear before the bench and ask his Attorney General to read the commission of appointment. In nearly 35 years on the court, the third longest tenure in American history, Justice Stevens became renowned for his independence. Stevens wrote more dissents than anyone else in the court's history, knowing that future justices rely on dissents for their context and content. Among his writings, Stevens insisted on protecting the wall of separation between church and state, that government must never impose any orthodoxy. How important this is today as we see another minority group, Muslim Americans, currently facing bigotry and fear. Japanese Americans know well what can happen when the levee fails and constitutional rights are washed away. The cases of Yasui, Hirabayashi, and Korematsu remind us how important the Supreme Court is to us all, especially during times of conflict or war. World War II is ultimately a story of triumphs born of tragedies. Justice Stevens and Japanese-American MIS linguists working in parallel assure Allied victory in the Pacific. The decorated heroism of Japanese-American volunteers fighting and dying in Europe, even as 120,000 Japanese-American civilians were interned by the U.S. government. This patriotism and perseverance led in 1988 to redress for the personal justice denied to Japanese Americans. It was an historic moment when a nation apologized and committed itself never to revisit this mistake upon any group of Americans ever again. In recognition of his service to our country and for his devotion to the letter and spirit of the U.S. Constitution, the National Japanese American Memorial Foundation is proud to present its 2010 Award for Constitutional Rights to Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens.